Lakeview, Colorado, a tranquil town nestled against the foothills of the Rockies, was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries and families built stable lives. At the center of one such family was David Langston. David was a prominent figure in Lakeview, known for his success as a real estate agent. With his polished appearance, charming demeanor, and undeniable business acumen, he had built a thriving career, turning the Langston name into one synonymous with success in Lakeview's small but competitive real estate market. David lived in a spacious home on the outskirts of town with his wife, Mary Langston, the principal of the local high school. She was respected in the community for her dedication to education and her efforts to mentor troubled students. Together, they formed what appeared to be an ideal family, radiating stability and success. Mary had a son from a previous relationship, Justin, a college student and part-time bartender at a local bar. While Justin's rebellious streak often caused tension, the Langstons had worked hard to maintain an outwardly united front. Behind the suburban facade, however, cracks in the Langstons' seemingly perfect lives were beginning to show. David, a man who was meticulous about keeping up appearances, had a secret one that would ultimately destroy the life he had worked so hard to build. Despite the image of a faithful, loving husband, David was involved in a clandestine affair. That this affair was far more damaging than a typical marital indiscretion. David's secret lover was none other than his stepson, Justin. Their relationship was toxic and fraught with emotional manipulation. For years, David had convinced Justin that their affair was a shared secret, one that neither of them could ever reveal. David's duplicity ran deeper still. While Justin believed he had some form of exclusive claim to David's attention, David's appetite for control and secrecy led him to pursue other illicit relationships. Justin, who had always struggled with feelings of abandonment and insecurity, was crushed when he discovered David's infidelities. The betrayal was personal and painful, setting in motion a series of events that would culminate in tragedy. On June 27, 2014, that simmering tension finally erupted. The day began like any other. Mary left for work at the high school early, her mind focused on an upcoming district meeting. Justin, who had spent the previous night drinking heavily and growing increasingly despondent over his recent discoveries, stayed in bed well past noon. David, meanwhile, had scheduled several property viewings and a late lunch with a potential buyer. By the end of the day, one of them would be dead. When Mary returned home that evening, she was met with an unsettling silence. The usual hum of David's evening routine was absent, and the house seemed unnervingly still. She called for her husband but received no response. Heading down into the basement, where David often unwound after a long day, Mary stumbled upon a scene of unimaginable horror. David's lifeless body lay sprawled on the cold cement floor, a belt still wrapped tightly around his neck. Bloodstains marked the floor, evidence of a brutal struggle. In that moment, Mary's world shattered. Her husband was dead, and she was standing in the middle of what looked like a murder scene. The Lakeview Police Department was immediately alerted, and within the hour, detectives arrived at the Langston residence. Detective Joseph Clark, a seasoned investigator with over 2 decades of experience, was assigned to the case. Clark had seen his fair share of homicides, but something about this one felt different from the start. David Langston wasn't just any victim. His prominence in the community meant this case would garner significant public attention. But more than that, the scene itself told a story, one of rage, betrayal, and personal conflict. Clark and his team began by cordoning off the crime scene and conducting a preliminary sweep of the house. The signs of a violent confrontation were immediately apparent. David's body bore multiple bruises, likely from a struggle that took place before he was strangled. The belt around his neck was pulled tight, suggesting that whoever had killed him had done so with a great deal of force and possibly anger. The first person Clark needed to interview was Mary. She was visibly shaken but cooperative. Her alibi was quickly established. She had been at work all day, confirmed by several colleagues at the school. While it was possible she had orchestrated the killing, Clark's instincts told him otherwise. Mary's shock seemed genuine, and there was no immediate evidence linking her to the murder. Still, standard procedure dictated that she remain a person of interest until more information surfaced. As detectives canvassed the neighborhood, they began piecing together David's final hours. Witnesses reported seeing David leave his office in the afternoon and return home around 4 p.m. No one reported hearing or seeing anything unusual afterward. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, indicating that David likely knew his killer and had let them into the house willingly. Then came the discovery that changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. Tucked away in the basement, Cleverly hidden among some old storage boxes was a small camouflaged camera. It wasn't the kind of surveillance equipment one would expect in a typical home security system. This camera was discreet, almost spy-like, positioned to record without being noticed. Clark had the footage retrieved and reviewed it immediately. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The grainy footage captured the final moments of David Langston's life. In the video, David is seen in a heated argument with Justin, his stepson. The altercation quickly turned physical, with Justin grabbing a nearby belt and wrapping it around David's neck in a fit of blind fury. Within moments, David collapsed and Justin fled the scene. The camera, which had likely been installed by David to monitor his home without anyone's knowledge, had caught his own murder. Clark knew then that the case was no longer about speculation. The truth had been captured on film. With the hidden camera footage in hand, Detective Joseph Clark's team shifted their focus entirely to Justin Langston. The video was damning. It captured not only the fatal altercation but also the raw, emotional volatility between Justin and his stepfather. Now it was up to Clark to piece together the why. What had led Justin to kill David in such a brutal manner? And how long had this toxic dynamic been simmering beneath the surface of the Langston household? Clark's first step was to locate Justin, who had not been seen since the murder was discovered. It didn't take long for the police to track him down. Justin was found at his apartment above a local bar where he worked part-time, intoxicated and disoriented. He was brought in for questioning but remained sullen and uncooperative. He didn't deny his involvement in the altercation but stopped short of confessing to murder, claiming that things had just gotten out of control. As detectives delved deeper into Justin's background, a troubling history emerged. Justin had always been somewhat of a troubled youth. After his biological father left when he was a child, he struggled with feelings of abandonment and resentment, acting out in school and falling into bouts of depression. When Mary married David, Justin had been hesitant to accept his new stepfather. But David, always the charming figure, had made a concerted effort to win the boy over. What began as an effort to bond soon evolved into something far more sinister. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Justin and David's secret relationship had started years earlier, when Justin was still a teenager. Manipulated by David, Justin had been drawn into an unhealthy, secret affair, convinced that he couldn't share his burden with anyone. David had used his position of power and authority to maintain control over Justin, all while continuing his facade of a devoted husband and father. The discovery of David's other relationships had shattered whatever illusion of love or loyalty Justin had left. According to several of Justin's friends, he had grown increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to the murder, plagued by a toxic mix of anger, shame, and betrayal. David's infidelity wasn't just a violation of trust, it was a final insult in a long line of manipulations that Justin had endured for years. One friend who had been close to Justin since high school told police that Justin had confided in her about his relationship with David shortly before the murder. He was breaking down, she said. He felt used, like he was just another one of David's conquests. I think that realization destroyed him. She added that Justin had recently confronted David about his affairs, but she had no idea it would escalate to murder. With the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Detective Clark knew they had enough to formally charge Justin with murder. So surveillance footage was irrefutable evidence of Justin's actions. But the context of the crime, the years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and betrayal added a layer of complexity that would soon unfold in the courtroom. The trial of Justin Langston began in August 2014, drawing widespread attention both locally and regionally. The case was not just about a brutal murder, but about the shocking secrets that had been hiding in plain sight for years. News outlets covered every detail from the initial charges to the salacious nature of the hidden relationship between Justin and his stepfather. For many in the quiet town of Lakeview, it was difficult to reconcile the image of David Langston, the charming and successful real estate agent, with the man described in court, a manipulative predator who had preyed on his own stepson. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Laura Smith, presented a straightforward case. They had the footage, which showed the fatal moment when Justin strangled David. They argued that the murder was a premeditated act, driven by jealousy and a sense of betrayal. Justin, they contended, had discovered David's other relationships and acted out of rage. It wasn't an impulsive act, they claimed, but a calculated one. Justin had the presence of mind to use a weapon, a belt, and had ample opportunity to walk away before things escalated. He chose not to. The defense, however, presented a very different narrative. Led by defense attorney Michael Freeman, they argued that Justin had been pushed to the brink by years of emotional and psychological abuse at the hands of David. Freeman framed Justin as a deeply troubled young man who had been manipulated into a secretive and abusive relationship by his stepfather. The murder, he argued, was not premeditated but rather the tragic outcome of years of bottled-up pain and frustration. Freeman described Justin's actions as those of a person acting under severe emotional distress, his mind clouded by years of trauma and manipulation. As the trial unfolded, both sides called a parade of witnesses to the stand. The prosecution focused on the forensic evidence in the surveillance footage, which showed Justin as the aggressor. The defense, meanwhile, highlighted Justin's troubled upbringing, his history of mental health issues, and the toxic relationship that had defined much of his teenage years. One of the most pivotal moments in the trial came when Justin himself took the stand. Visibly shaken and emotional, he recounted his years of torment, painting a picture of a young man who had been groomed and controlled by a man he both loved and hated. "I didn't know what was right anymore," Justin said, his voice cracking. "David made me believe that what we had was normal. But when I found out he was lying to me, lying about everything, I lost it. I couldn't control myself." Despite his testimony, the prosecution remained firm in their stance. District Attorney Smith emphasized that no matter what the history between the two men, Justin had still made a conscious decision to end David's life. He had not walked away when he had the chance. As the trial neared its conclusion, tension in the courtroom grew. The case had captivated not only the town of Lakeview but also a wider audience, with national media picking up on the scandalous details of the affair between David and his stepson. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, locals, and those eager to hear the final arguments. The defense, in their closing statement, implored the jury to understand the emotional weight Justin had carried for years. Michael Freeman framed Justin as a victim first and foremost, a young man who had been coerced into an illicit, damaging relationship by a man twice his age. Freeman argued that Justin had not entered the confrontation with David intending to kill him, but had acted out of desperation and overwhelming emotional distress. The defense acknowledged the tragedy of David's death but insisted that the crime was one of passion, not premeditated murder. Freeman emphasized Justin's psychological state at the time of the crime, asserting that Justin had simply snapped after years of psychological manipulation. On the other hand, District Attorney Laura Smith remained unyielding. In her closing argument, she reiterated that despite whatever torment Justin may have endured, he had still made a conscious choice to commit murder. "We have the evidence," she said, pointing to the jury. "We have the video that shows, without a doubt, that Justin Langston strangled David Langston to death. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment fight that escalated by accident. This was murder." The prosecution emphasized that regardless of any emotional manipulation, Justin's actions were deliberate. Smith also argued that the defense was using Justin's troubled past as an excuse to explain away an act of cold-blooded murder. The jury deliberated for several days, carefully weighing the evidence presented by both sides. The video footage was undeniable, but the defense had successfully planted seeds of doubt about Justin's mental state. In the end, the question wasn't whether Justin had killed David. Everyone agreed on that fact, but rather whether it had been an impulsive act born from a broken mind or a calculated, premeditated crime of passion and jealousy. Finally, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, the air thick with anticipation. Justin sat at the defense table, his face pale, hands clasped tightly in front of him. His mother, Mary Langston, sat behind him, her expression stoic but her eyes red from days of weeping. The jury found Justin Langston guilty of second-degree murder. It was a devastating blow to the defense, but the verdict reflected a certain degree of compassion for Justin's troubled state of mind. Second-degree murder, while still a serious charge, carried a lesser sentence than the first-degree murder conviction the prosecution had pushed for. The jury had recognized the emotional turmoil that had driven Justin to commit the crime, but they could not absolve him of responsibility for David's death. When the judge announced the verdict, Justin showed little visible reaction. He had spent weeks on an emotional roller coaster, and now, at this final moment, he seemed almost resigned to his fate. His mother, Mary, broke down quietly, clutching her handkerchief to her face as the reality of the situation sank in. The sentencing phase came next. After hearing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, the judge sentenced Justin to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. It was a harsh sentence, but one that took into account the years of abuse Justin had endured. The judge, in his closing remarks, expressed his sympathy for Justin's situation, but emphasized that no matter the emotional trauma involved, a life had been taken, and there had to be consequences. In the aftermath of the trial, the town of Lakeview was left reeling. The Langston family, once seen as a pillar of the community, had been irreparably shattered. The details that emerged during the trial, the secret affair, the manipulative relationship between David and Justin, left the town's residents shocked and uneasy. Many struggled to reconcile the image of David Langston, the successful real estate agent and respected community member, with the man who had preyed on his own stepson. Whispers circulated around town, with some questioning whether Mary had truly been ignorant of the affair. Others pitied her, seeing her as another victim in David's web of deceit. The Langston home, once a symbol of prosperity, now stood empty and abandoned, a constant reminder of the dark secrets it had concealed for so long. To Mary, devastated by both the loss of her husband and the incarceration of her son, withdrew from public life. She resigned from her position as school principal and moved to a neighboring town to escape the constant reminders of the tragedy. Those who had once admired her strength and leadership now spoke of her with hushed voices, a mix of pity and gossip trailing in her wake. For Justin, prison became both a punishment and a form of escape. In interviews conducted with prison psychologists, he admitted to feeling a sense of relief after the trial ended. The years of secrecy and emotional turmoil had taken a toll, and while he regretted the loss of his stepfather's life, he also felt freed from the lies that had bound him for so long. In his darkest moments, he wondered if the price of his freedom had been too high. The town, too, grappled with the moral complexities of the case. Some residents viewed Justin as a monster, someone who had taken a life out of jealousy and rage. Others saw him as a victim, a young man manipulated by a predator who had ultimately reached his breaking point. Local newspapers ran editorials debating the fairness of the trial, with opinions deeply divided on whether justice had truly been served. In time, the media circus around the case died down, and Lakeview slowly returned to its quiet, unassuming self. But the scars remained. David Langston's name was forever tarnished, and the once gilded image of the Langston family had been irreparably damaged. The case became part of local lore, a dark chapter in the town's history that would be retold in hushed tones for years to come. Meanwhile, Justin's sentence marked the beginning of a long and uncertain future. Though he had escaped a life sentence, the 25-year term ahead of him weighed heavily on his mind. Prison was a far cry from the life he had envisioned, and the reality of his situation began to sink in as the days stretched into months, and the months into years. In many ways, the tragedy of David Langston's murder was not confined to the courtroom. Its ripple effects spread through the lives of everyone involved: Mary, Justin, and the town of Lakeview itself. A once respected family was left in ruins, with its surviving members forever haunted by the secrets that had come to light. Justin Langston's life in prison was marked by long stretches of solitude and reflection. Incarcerated at a medium-security facility, he found himself surrounded by other inmates whose stories, while different, shared common threads of broken homes, betrayal, and trauma. At 24, Justin was one of the younger inmates, and his quiet demeanor kept him out of most conflicts in the beginning. But inside, the weight of his actions and the enormity of what he had done gnawed at him daily. Prison wasn't just about survival for Justin, it was also about coming to terms with his past. The years of abuse, manipulation, and secrecy that had defined his relationship with David Langston were never far from his thoughts. Justin attended regular therapy sessions with a prison counselor, part of the rehabilitation program that aimed to help inmates work through their emotional issues. In these sessions, he often relived the painful memories of his teenage years, the confusion he felt about his stepfather's behavior, and the betrayal that ultimately led him to kill. The prison psychologist, Dr. Rachel Abbott, saw in Justin a man deeply scarred by the manipulation he had endured. He had been groomed by a person he was supposed to trust, and that trauma had left deep emotional wounds. "It's hard to explain," Justin once told her in a rare moment of vulnerability. "I hated him for what he did, but there was part of me that still loved him. I was so angry at myself for feeling that way." Dr. Abbott saw this internal conflict as central to Justin's struggles, and over time, they worked through his feelings of guilt, shame, and unresolved grief. Justin's behavior in prison was largely compliant, and he avoided trouble where he could. However, the reality of prison life was harsh. The isolation was suffocating, and the rigid structure of daily life, while safe in some ways, was also stifling. He missed the freedom of the outside world, but most of all, he missed his mother, Mary. Though she visited him as often as she could, their relationship had been strained by the events that had unfolded. Mary had always been a loving mother, but she now carried her own burden of guilt, wondering if she had failed her son by not seeing the signs of what had been happening in her own home. Justin's internal world grew quieter as the years passed. He became resigned to his fate, accepting that prison would be his reality for a long time. Yet the therapy sessions with Dr. Abbott became his lifeline, a place where he could process the events that had led to his incarceration. He no longer spoke of David with anger or hate. Instead, there was a numbness in his voice when he mentioned his stepfather, a numbness born from years of reflection on the manipulative relationship that had consumed much of his youth. Occasionally, Justin would receive letters from old friends, though many had distanced themselves after the trial. Some couldn't reconcile the Justin they had known with the man convicted of killing his stepfather, while others found it easier to avoid the mess of emotions his case stirred up. He understood their reasons, though it deepened his sense of isolation. There were moments when Justin would wonder if life would ever change, if the outside world would remember him once he had served his time, or if he would forever remain the man who had killed his stepfather in a fit of rage. Mary Langston's life after the trial was a portrait of grief and quiet suffering. Once a respected principal and a fixture of Lakeview's community, she now found herself adrift, carrying the twin burdens of losing her husband and watching her son go to prison. She had moved out of the family home after the trial, unable to bear the weight of the memories that haunted every corner of the house. The house, once a symbol of the Langston family's success, now stood abandoned, its windows shuttered and its garden overgrown. Mary's days were spent in near isolation. She had relocated to a small apartment in a nearby town, cutting off most ties with Lakeview. The whispers and sideways glances that had followed her in the wake of the trial had become too much to bear. Though some in Lakeview expressed sympathy for her situation, others questioned whether she had been truly unaware of David's actions. Had she really known nothing about the relationship between David and Justin? The doubts, whether spoken aloud or not, weighed on her heavily. While she had resigned from her job as principal, Mary remained dedicated to education, taking on part-time work as a tutor for struggling students. It gave her a small sense of purpose, but the satisfaction she had once found in her career was gone. Every day felt like a reminder of how she had failed to protect her family, particularly Justin. Her relationship with Justin, once close, had been irrevocably changed. She visited him in prison as often as she could, but their conversations were often stilted, filled with long silences. Mary struggled to reconcile the son she loved with the man who had killed her husband. She knew that David had manipulated Justin, but part of her still grappled with the anger of what had been taken from her. How did I miss it? She often asked herself. The guilt was relentless, gnawing at her in the quiet moments of the night. During their visits, Justin and Mary rarely spoke of David. It was a subject too painful to touch. Instead, they spoke about Justin's life in prison, Mary's work, and the small, mundane details of their lives. But even these conversations felt forced, as if they were both avoiding the elephant in the room. Mary longed to comfort her son, to tell him that everything would be all right. But the truth was that nothing felt all right anymore. Their family had been shattered beyond repair. Despite the strained nature of their visits, Mary refused to give up on Justin. She still saw him as the boy she had raised, the boy who had been broken by a man she had loved and trusted. Or in her heart, she believed that Justin could heal, that he could one day leave prison a better man. But the path to that future was long, and Mary often wondered if she would live to see it. As the years passed, Mary's visits became less frequent. It wasn't a conscious decision, but life had a way of wearing her down. The long drives to the prison, the emotional toll of seeing her son behind bars, the constant reminders of her family's tragedy, it all took a toll. But even when she couldn't visit, she wrote to Justin regularly, sending him letters filled with small updates about her life, offers of support, and words of encouragement. In these letters, she often wrote about the garden she had started outside her apartment. It was a modest plot, just a few flowers and herbs, but it gave her something to care for, something to nurture. It was her way of finding a small measure of peace in a world that had been turned upside down. As the years stretched on, Justin Langston slowly adapted to his life behind bars. He continued his therapy sessions and even began mentoring younger inmates, sharing his story as a cautionary tale of how hidden pain can destroy lives. Though still haunted by his past, Justin started finding purpose in helping others avoid the path that had led him to his cell. His time was marked by quiet introspection, punctuated by the occasional letters from his mother, Mary, who remained his strongest connection to the outside world.